Hey y'all. Hey. Happy Friday, everybody. Let's see. I'm going to get Deb in here immediately. Hey.
Hey,
Hey there, Deb.
hey, how you doing?
I'm doing really well. So, back at it again, folks. I'm Therese Nelson, and I am back on Black Food Folks this beautiful Friday in conversation with Deb Freeman, who I have admired for some time.
Oh,
She's the editor of Southern Grit magazine, which I think is 5 years old now. It's
almost
quite
5 years
far,
old.
almost
Yeah.
5 years ago, based out of Virginia. And I always know I'm going to love somebody when they are intense about culinary history and I don't even know them. So I just remember sort of starting to follow your Twitter feed and thinking a lot about Virginia in my own research, finding someone who was in that place and thinking about food in really intentional ways was I was interested in to watch the work you've been doing so far. It's been really beautiful to watch. So I'm glad to be chatting with you today.
Wow. No, well, thank you so much. I've been such an admirer of yours for a long time. So when Clay emailed me, I was like, with Therese? Oh my God. So, so thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'm really honored to speak with you. So thank you so much.
So there's so many things to talk about, and I want to be respectful of your time. And we tend to go about the whole hour, but I really would love it if you could talk a little bit about the work you do, because I know I'm most interested in folks who are in food, and I know like via food, but have lives that are really sort of adjacent to food or even outside of food. And I know your life is professionally in politics in a great deal, but you could sort of talk about sort of your life, your real life, like sort of work you do full time, but then how you kind of got into food and how, especially Southern Great, came into your life.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in my day to day life, I'm a communications director for a political nonprofit. And so, I've always been involved in politics. My first job out of college was in politics. I worked on Capitol Hill for a while during the Clinton impeachment hearings. So, that was a really wild
Jesus.
time to be in DC and right out of college. But yes, I've been doing that, for off and on for 20 years in politics, but more specifically working in communications and marketing. And as far as how I got into food, honestly, there was a publication in Hampton Roads, which is the coastal area of Virginia, called Southern Grit. And so a friend of mine dropped it off on my desk and said at work and said, you might really enjoy this. And I was just like, oh, okay. And it literally sat there for maybe 2 months. And I never looked at it. And then when I opened it, I was like, oh my gosh, this is really interesting. And Southern Grit was created um, to really talk about food in Hampton Roads and the food scene in that area. Because everyone was saying, oh, there's not good food here. You have to go to DC, you have to go to Richmond. And that wasn't true. And so I pitched an article to the editor, to Joshua Fitzwater, who's the editor and publisher. And it was about the crab ladies. And the crab ladies were women who picked crab in Hampton, Virginia, and essentially were able to buy houses, send their children to college through picking crab. And that was kind of the gateway drug for me, because these are things that, I love crab, I eat crab, I'm very much a part of where I'm from as far as waterways and foodways are concerned, but I never really put two and two together as far as where those things came from, who was creating them, who was making it. And so it was off to a start at that point. But that was my first foray. And then shortly afterwards, he asked me to write a piece on the origins of barbecue. And so my second piece was called Lost in the Sauce. And it was about enslaved people creating barbecue, being they are the original pitmasters. They are the original creators of barbecue, obviously along with Native American techniques and Europeans bringing in vinegar, but the technique and who was digging the pits and actually cooking the hogs were enslaved people. And so it was a wrap after that. I'm like, all right, we are talking about history. We're talking about Black people. We're talking about, the foundation of what is America's cuisine. And so I thought that these are stories that need to be told, and they're crying out to be told. And so that's where it all started for me.
I love that because I think it's like, I feel like history is kind of infectious. Like once you can't unknow certain stories once you find them out, and it forces you down these really interesting rabbit holes where you end up in spaces you didn't even think about. I would love it if you could talk a little bit about, because I'm from New Jersey, right? Like I'm born and bred in Newark, New Jersey, but I'm also a second generation child of migration. And I feel like very often, I talk a lot with a lot of Northern chefs who talk a lot about this connection to the South. And I'm interested in Virginia specifically because Virginia is really particular. You sort of think of it as like the birth of the sort of, foundation of the nation. We think about it relative to colonial era where a lot of our foodways are kind of giving birth. We talk a lot about like Richmond and like, I don't know, just this really particular way we think about and frame Virginia. And it's Southern, but it's not, and it's complicated. And so I guess I'm wondering about, because there's something really particular about a regional magazine that old. So somebody who was thinking about regional cuisine in the midst of a place like Virginia that long ago. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what it is to. Are you from Virginia originally?
I am. I grew up in Norfolk, Virginia, so that's definitely it's. I wasn't born here, but I was bred here, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so if you could just talk about that, because it just feels, I mean, think about, when I think of Virginia, I think of Richmond, I think of Edna Lewis and Freetown, I think about, it's just a very particular kind of, I think of Mount Monticello and James Hemings, and it's this really particular lore around Virginia, but it is Southern, but is by way of, it feels, or sort of transitional. So I wonder if you just talk a little bit about being from Virginia, thinking about food in Virginia.
Okay, so I'm going to get on a soapbox for just a second.
I love it.
So I'm going to adjust my chair so I can get ready. So Virginia is really interesting, as you said. It's not Southern, it is Southern. But what is really interesting as far as food in Virginia is concerned is that not a lot of people think of Virginia as the birthplace of macaroni and cheese via James Hemings. They don't think of it as the birthplace of American barbecue. They don't think of it as the birthplace of whiskey. They don't think of it as the birthplace, my assertion, of American fried chicken as we know it, is Virginia. And so there are all these culinary, Southern culinary foods that are staples that you will find Alabama, Georgia, Texas, South Carolina, but it started here, right? And so I don't think people are having those conversations. So it's twofold, really. It's not only, that Black people and enslaved Black people were doing the labor and being the table for America's foodways, but it's here in the state. And so, part of what I think I'm charged to do somehow is to really kind of illuminate that, because there are all these amazing foods that come here, but they start here. There's no way you have Texas barbecue, Memphis barbecue without Virginia. As I said earlier with James Hemings, whipped cream, ice cream, macaroni and cheese, that's here. And so it's just this really interesting thing that people think, no, you got to go to South Carolina, North Carolina barbecue. No, it's the Commonwealth state. It is absolutely Virginia. And so I think what is difficult is trying to change these sort of historical misrecords, if you will, and miscategorizations about where Southern food comes from.
Yeah, that's a lot, and it's also something because I've been talking a lot with folks in New Orleans specifically, but really kind of all throughout the South, and there feels to me this sort of moment where, and I don't know how to say it without, because it's not defensiveness, but it's certainly a desire for specificity in the way we talk about the South. I think it's similar to a conversation I have with a lot of my Caribbean friends, and it's certainly a conversation that folks are having on the continent, where we do a disservice to the zeitgeist when we aren't specific, because people who don't know our culture, don't understand our culture, will accept the generalities that we made. And so it's like we need more complexity in these moments, right? We need like people to be more particular about the references they use for their own work. I would love it if you could talk a little bit about, because again, like this, I think some of the ways in which I first became aware of your work was through barbecue, and Firefly on Fork is a conference, is a sort of festival. This last year is my second year going down, and this last year I got a chance to moderate a panel with Howard Conyers,
Yeah.
two local chefs, and Adrian Miller. And one of the things that we got, I'm so sad I missed you with that one, but one of the things that Howard really talked a lot about was his confusion or sort of this thought around the fact that as we sort of our like collective imagination is so wide around barbecue, but that he was expecting that Virginia would have more specificity in the way that they, at least the folks he was talking to, were thinking about barbecue. And I guess I'm wondering if you could sort of expand on that a little bit, like, because your point, right? Like you how do you have this dope history around this sort of birthplace of this beautiful tradition, but there isn't really a sort of like, I mean, you found all kinds of barbecue in Virginia, at least when I was there, and the folks I was talking to were doing Memphis style or doing Texas style or
Right.
Carolina, and it was all started from in Virginia, but it just feels like there wasn't a really particular Virginia centric barbecue scene, which seems strange to me.
Yeah, I think honestly, I think that is because Virginia barbecue comes from a tradition of community. And so versus kitchen and restaurant barbecue. So, traditionally, as hog killing, when you have the barbecue, it's about communities getting together and gathering and eating and celebrating. But that was really kind of the genesis of what Virginia barbecue was. And so I think that as it traveled further south to North Carolina, because that's really who gets a lot of shine, as it traveled further south, they kind of have taken on this moniker of North Carolina barbecue. But in the 1800s, a great book actually by Joseph Haynes called Virginia Barbecue History, he talks about how there are all these publications that specifically talk about selling Virginia barbecue all over the country. But I think
Gotcha.
what gets lost is a lot of those pit masters were really keeping it in a community focus. And not bringing it to restaurants. That's my opinion. I think that might be Joe Haynes' opinion. I won't speak for him, but I think that might be where it comes from. That
That's an
misconception.
excellent point. No, I think you wanted something there. And it brings me to this thought I've been really struggling with, or I feel like in the midst of COVID, we're talking a lot about restaurants and the way that they're going to be able to rebound. And like it's this real particular conversation that we have, and it is really specific about the fragility of restaurants. And I guess it's making me think a lot about the ways in which Black culture and food, at least, has always, the point she's made about those barbecue traditions being about like community and sort of about home cooking and less about like the commercial aspect of it is really important, because I'm hearing the same, like it's so strange because I'm hearing the same conversations or asking the same questions of Caribbean chefs specifically, but also, I mean, folks from the continent. I don't know if you know Chef Binta. She's a Fulani chef.
I've heard of her. Yeah.
Basically, she's dope, right? But she talked a lot about this sort of nomadic nature of the
Mm,
Fulani people and those food ways. And she's kind of trying to translate that into a space that does not, there's no reference point for the sort of restaurant space, sort of commercial nature of food as it relates to culture. So it's like this trying to fit this really beautiful, lush, particular culture in this framework that doesn't really work, or at least it doesn't really fit exactly. And so I guess
right.
I'm wondering about, especially now, I think your magazine is so interested in sort of food culture, but as it's happening on the ground, um, what folks are feeling right now is they're trying to sort of this region is so precious about specificity and regionality, this sort of preciousness of Hampton Roads and just that sort of this culture. How are people thinking about rebuilding and rethinking? Because I think a lot of it is going to have to do with like rethinking restaurants altogether, which might be dope food culture
Right.
wise because it sort of helps you reframe. But I'm wondering about what folks are feeling out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that reinvention is really what's going to have to happen because, there's no indication when, you're going to be able to be, shoulder to shoulder with somebody in a restaurant anymore. And so I think pop-ups are really starting to be super popular along with food trucks, where, you know, unfortunately you don't really get that sense of communal dining. You don't have that. But I think that's a really interesting space where people who may not have had the capital to, you know, pay for rent in a building or purchase a building, you know, they could, you know, do something a little more cheaply, you know, to still get their food out there. And so, like, a lot of what I see on social media in this area in particular are people who are small restaurateurs who are trying new things and on a smaller scale, and trying that via food trucks and via the pop-up. And I think that that's a lower cost option,
Yeah.
for people to still do what they want to do, but somehow get around the idea of paying, you know, $2,500 a month or whatever the case may be, just in rent, you know. And so, and I also think that it's the opportunity for, you know, someone who doesn't have a staff, for someone who, you know, it's maybe two people, maybe it's one person, to really, there's a lane now, you know, because there's not going to be as much competition. And I think that there's a real opportunity there.
Yeah, I
And that's
love
what
that.
my
Yeah, no, 100%. Because I feel like there's sort of I don't know. I just feel like there's a sort of myopathy sometimes where we aren't just. I guess I'm also thinking because and nobody's really given me a good answer yet. And maybe it's because there really isn't one yet. But I guess I wonder about again, like being a child of the North, right? Like there's my main references for like these really deep rooted Southern traditions is by way of like summer vacations or like hearsay. And I mean always interested when people have these really visceral, particular like sense memories growing up about these food traditions. And I guess I would love it if you could talk a little bit about let's talk a little bit more about the idea of barbecue not being beholden to restaurants, because I was thinking about there's something really interesting about kind of what Howard is doing in terms of like talking to a lot of older pitmasters who are, you know, thinking about passing on baton and sort of passing on
Sure.
tradition, but also thinking about like that intergenerational passing on of information. This sort of sense that like there is this fragility to the lack of intergenerational continuity in these traditions. And I'm wondering if you are thinking at all about, I guess, I don't know, it's weird because I'm thinking about like Scott barbecue. Like my people from South Carolina, like that sort of Conway,
Yep.
Hemingway,
Mm-hmm.
Lara, Marion, Corda.
Yeah.
And there are all these little jewel boxes of tradition throughout these quarters, right? And I'm sure they exist where you're from. And these places, these spaces that were restaurants, but not really. They were
Mm-hmm.
generational, but because it was almost like a public trust. I guess I'm wondering about, I don't know, how do you, because right now barbecue is a big thing. It's proliferating in Virginia. And
Yeah.
do you, and it's also, I mean, it's also being gentrified in a lot of really important ways. And I guess I'm wondering about what that cross-cultural, that kind of interplay is, and like what I don't know. I just talk a little bit more because that was such an interesting point you were making.
Yeah. I mean, I think what's interesting, and so, you know, earlier this year, Southern Grit put on Barbecue Wars 2, and so it was a competition of pitmasters.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the really cool pieces of it was we did an authentic, well, as authentic as we could, Virginia barbecue. So that's digging the pit, that's putting the whole hog out, you know, it's just dressed with vinegar, salt, pepper, like just as basic as you can be.
Yeah.
But like what was cool is we fed 300 people, but we walked them through and showed them this is where it started. And so there were so many people that came up to me or commented on social media that they had no idea that this is what it was. Because I think, to your point about gentrification, you know, you might see some ribs, you know, brisket, which is the hot thing, right? But
Mm-hmm.
like, but where all that tradition comes from, most people don't see that anymore. And but I do think that there's starting to be a movement here. There's an outfit out of Woodstock, Virginia, who they did a whole hog barbecue last year. So I think that's starting to be a little bit of a resurgence, and I think that's important. I think that's really important. I think that, you know, as lovely as it is to see, you know, the stereotypical pitmaster. What I think is funny is the stereotypical pitmaster today is not the stereotypical pitmaster from 200 years ago, but that's a whole different conversation.
I was
But but what's cool is seeing people embrace techniques and standards and practices from years ago, from these people who did all of this by hand, enslaved people who, well, one, had no choice, two, did it by hand, three, taking 12 to 14 hours to create something that's really beautiful and really meaningful and celebratory in a lot of ways. That's something that's really wonderful.
Yeah. Okay. So I would love it if we could talk a little bit about your life in politics, because especially now, I'm really interested in so much. I'm interested, but I think there's this really particular. You talked about like DC being adjacent to DC. There's this really particular way in which I think we aren't in the food space. I don't know that we are thinking as broadly about the necessity of political activation as we should. I think this moment is showing a lot of people like James Beard Foundation, a couple others that think about advocacy work. That's really interesting, but I'm unsure that we are thinking about how much impact we really have on the way in which government works, right? Like the idea of being a business owner immediately implies that you should be invested and engaged in your local and city government. So I guess I don't know. It's so many years in politics and so many years in thinking about communication and what that disconnect is, maybe.
Yeah.
Are you thinking at all about, especially it's because your publication is so tied to the restaurant industry? Are you thinking at all about what that should look like or what people should be kind of considering?
Yeah, I mean, I have a whole bunch of thoughts listening to you kind of ask that question. Like, all politics is local, right? So if you're a restaurant in the community, whether it's gentrified or not, you already have an immediate tie to that community. And I do think on some level, there's a responsibility to that community. When you decide to open up a business, there's a level of, you need to understand who your neighbors are and really, understand what's going on that street, in that community, in that neighborhood. I think that we have perhaps gotten away from that. And I think that a lot of people have don't even associate food with activism, but, the women from the club with no name, for example, like, how, I mean? Like, that is a prime example of how food is activism. Chef Cassandra Lofton, who's working with Bakers Against Racism, and I just got her pound cake yesterday, and fire, oh my God. But, but these are small ways that restaurants, chefs, even people who just cook well, who wouldn't be considered a chef, can participate in political life and try to make a difference politically and in their community. It's important to stay engaged. And I think that there are ways that restaurants can think about their practices as far as, thinking about the most delicate way to put this, thinking about how they treat their diners, how they treat their servers. I think that this is a really good moment for that. But I think more importantly is deciding if they're going to invest thousands of dollars into a building in a gentrified neighborhood, that they need to understand what the needs of that community are as well, because they're making a choice to be there. So you need to understand what is happening.
Yeah. I was talking to Shakira Simley a couple of weeks ago, and she's the director of the Department of Racial Equity for the city of San Francisco. And their job is like, I don't know, it's a really interesting position. She said there are others around the country, but it's not necessarily a job that exists in a lot of cities. And she's talking a lot about how she just got a job. I remember an article came out, like, oh my goodness, she cared about but COVID struck like right away. Like, she was literally like a month in a job, and then so the enormity of what COVID was going to be kind of struck. And she talked a lot about how you get deputized in city government immediately. When a disaster happens, or something, catastrophic happens, you immediately deputize. And she was thinking a lot about through this how to reframe the lens of what's possible relative to government, because it was so much that got activated right away, and so many things, city services that she was now engaged in, that were helpful to communities that would have been helpful even outside the lens of COVID. And so she talked a lot about how we sort of the necessity of being engaged, activated politically would essentially help you to shift policy, right? Like there are things and systems and mechanisms that you know would work best for your business or best for the community in which you live. That having that connection to your local government will sort of make those things more, I don't know, viable. I talked to Joyce Chevalier as well out of Texas, and she sort of had the same sense. And I guess I'm just wondering about, what does that like tangibly? Is it just as simple as like going to your city council meeting? Is it just knowing who your council people are? Is it like what could engagement legitimately look like in terms from the perspective of someone who sees and works with politicians and folks who are should be beholden to the constituency? Like could citizenship look like for real in this moment?
Yeah, I mean, the squeaky wheel gets the oil, right? So if you don't know who your person is, your representative is, your council member is, your school board member, whatever the case may be, then they don't feel beholden. You are somebody who voted for a platform. You're a nameless, faceless entity. But, if you are actually engaged and you send an email or call an office, it doesn't have to take a whole bunch of time, but like, what's lost in politics, I think, are the relationships between constituents and who is voted in legislators. And I think that is why there are so many legislators who are kind of just listening to staff and insulated and thinking about lobbyists and answering to lobbyists. It's because we have become so insular in a way and so wrapped up in our own lives that, obviously, if you have a family and you're working 9 to 5 and you're trying to get dinner on the table, you're not necessarily thinking about, oh, I need to call my congressman today.
Yeah.
But you can't complain about it if you've not ever said, hey, this is a problem and I need you to talk to me about this. And I find that the more that you are in someone's face, and that's a little aggressive, but the more that you are emailing, the more that you are calling, then someone has to be responsive to you. And I think that's the beautiful thing about what's going on with activists in the streets now, is that like it's at a point where they have to listen to you, and it's empowering to think about young people who now understand that they do have a voice and they can use their voice. I think about a lot of issues as far as like, I mean, not to go super deep into like police actions and that sort of thing, but with a community resource board where there's some level of community involvement with police officers, and if there's a police shooting, something so small that does not cost money, or at least minimal amount of money, that could change an entire community. That can change how an entire community is policed. And that is because the only reason these things are happening now, these citizen review boards and these community review boards, is because legislators cannot ignore what's happening. And so that's a beautiful thing. That's something that's coming out of this movement, just understanding that there is a voice, there is power in voice, and speaking and interacting with your legislators and being engaged, because otherwise they're just going to do what they do, so that's what it looks like from my perspective, and it's, for me, I think that's positive. It gives me a sense of optimism, that the more shared ideas are at a table, the more diverse viewpoints, the more people around a table will really cause will create change.
Yes, ma'am. Okay, so we're doing really good time, about halfway through. I would love if we could circle back to the South. I don't know how much you're willing to talk about, but I don't know if you've been following sort of because it's a sort of a two-pronged next veer off.
Okay.
Um, I think a lot about spaces like Southern Foodway Alliance. I think a lot about, um, there are other organizations in the South that are thinking about food and culture. And it's something that John T. Edge said about, he kept using this, it was this one of his talks he did, he kept talking about a biracial South. And it hit my ear wrong, the way he kept
Mm.
saying it. It was a conversation with Tunde, John T. and Jamila Robinson. He kept using this phrase around a biracial South. And it struck me as strange, not strange, but as absurd the way he was framing it, because it, I think it dismisses the responsibility of seeing all cultures like exist in space. It also was an attempt, in my opinion, to sort of deflect the inequities that exist. Um, and I guess I'm thinking a lot about, well, I'm wondering about your feelings about the protection of Southern narratives, who like not so much who gets to tell stories, but really sort of what real multicultural conversations look like and how you think about them through the lens of Blackness. Because it's a really
Mm.
particular framework to like sort of be writing from, to thinking from. Um, and I think for myself at least, I know I get very mired in Blackness, right? Like my whole life is Black. My website is Black. My professional life is Black. And I know I have to check myself often in
Hmm.
terms of having more broad conversations, because
Yeah.
basically rooms for everybody Black, and that's just, it's not. Sometimes it sort of frames itself as dismissive
Sure.
of a necessity to be in community with a broader culture, and something about the way Southern Grit sort of is particular, but it also feels multicultural. I guess I'm just thinking about. I'm wondering if you're thinking at all about what that lens should look like and what the responsibility is, because it's not just this sort of, I don't know. Anyway, go ahead. I would love to hear.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. So
Yeah.
I think that I'm really proud of the work that Joshua Fitzwater, the editor of the magazine, has done to really try to tell a variety of stories. So that is definitely a kudos for him, that he recognizes that it's not just a white Southern lens, with a tattoo of some carrots on his arm. You know what I mean? Like there is more than that. So that's definitely a positive. I think that if you are telling these stories, obviously, as you said, you're coming from a Black lens, you tend to frame things in that lens, but it's like, but all these communities touch on each other. I mean, a really good example, I think, is yakame, the dish yakame. So, and for anyone who doesn't know, that's a dish, um, Hampton Roads. It's this a noodle dish that Chinese people basically came up with and marketed to African Americans, and just chicken, eggs, noodles, um, onions, and that's it pretty much. And first of all,
I
it's
didn't know.
delicious.
This last year, I didn't even realize that it touched Virginia, because my only reference point for it
Really?
was New Orleans. It was, I mean, Linda
Oh,
Green, the Akamine Queen. She talks about. I mean, it's a
right,
really
yeah.
because like the Vietnamese. It's a really particular thing there. I don't know
Hmm.
that I realized it was such a like it had a reference.
Virginia, and the yard mules are made right there in Norfolk. So, but anyway, but
Mm-hmm.
yeah, like that is something where two communities came together and they are feeding off each other. So these
Yeah,
noodles are Chinese, but obviously using ketchup and soy sauce, that to get like, who is doing that? And so I think there is a way that's a beautiful blend of cultures. And to your point, it's definitely not biracial. There are so many different immigrants and so many different stories that make up a southern story. um, and I think that that's wrong to kind of erase an Indian narrative or an Asian narrative, or something along those lines, that a Hispanic lens for that
right,
matter. And
right.
so there are all these things that exist here, and everyone has a story to tell, what I mean? And so I think that as long as you are respectful and inclusive enough and actually want to tell that story, and show that those connections are there, because there are these little connection points everywhere. And one would think, I imagine that, you know, if you're not necessarily, like you said, in Hampton Roads, you don't necessarily think about Yakima, you know, being Chinese or that sort of thing. But there's that legacy of those two cultures being tied together. I can think about, there's a Mexican white sauce that's served in Hampton Roads. And so that's very unique to that area. And it's served with tortilla chips. But then you've got these interesting, like, Mexican Americans in the South creating something new, but using tortilla chips. You know, like, these are the conversations that, you know, that really need to be talked about, because it's not biracial. It's, you know, it's multiracial. I think that would have been the better term for John T to use, for sure.
He kept saying it too. It's like nuts. If you get a chance, just circle back to it. It was the nuts. It was insane conversation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's a
yeah. Mm-hmm.
I guess because the other thing I'm also thinking a lot about, kind of in the same lane, but really more about media is, again, like, you know, the last 2 months have been explosive with reference to, like, food culture, like food history via Southern Foodways and a lot of that stuff. But also with reference to food media, and someone who's been in this editor's hat, like had the editor's cap on, is thinking about the way publication exists in the zeitgeist, and thinking a lot about how you tell stories and how beholden you are to the stories that you choose to tell. I guess I'm wondering about your thoughts about this, because everybody's having this. I remember a month ago, it was like this. Everyone's having this wild conversation about this explosiveness of, you know, food media being blown up, and it's about to be this transformational moment. And I was unsure. And I guess, like, my life is food media adjacent, and so I don't know that I have the right to have a particular opinion, but I guess I'm wondering about the lens of, like, someone who is entrenched in from a producer standpoint.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, you know, fortunately, you know, Southern Grit does not have the problems that Bon Appetit does, you know, or anything like that. But right. But I think it's just important I think the really important foundational thing is to really be respectful of these stories, because it's not just food. Like, food is the vehicle that I'm telling the story through, but that's not really the story. You know, going back to the crab pickers, it's not really about these women picking crab. It's about people being able to support themselves, send their child to Hampton University or whatever college they decide to go to through food. And so I think that being mindful that behind every dish is a story, is a person, is a family, is a narrative, that's what you have to be respectful of and always be mindful of, because it's not just barbecue, it's not just macaroni and cheese, it's not just sweet potato pie. Like, there are tangible stories and links to people and their histories that make up what we're putting in our mouths today. And I think that this idea, I mean, yes, I get why people are saying that, you know, food media is going to change and that sort of thing. I think in 6 months, it'll probably go back to the way it was, if we're being really honest, in my opinion. The only reason I say that.
No, I agree.
I mean, I hate to say that. Don't get me wrong. This is not something that I want to say or want to see. But I do think that it'll go back to, all right, well, you know, here's these chicken recipes, and we're going to focus on, you know, what's the easiest way to put dinner on the table in 30 minutes. I almost feel like if you have a story to tell, you have to create that lane for yourself. I mean, and, you know, hopefully someone will pick it up and you know, make sure that there's bandwidth for that. But if there's a story that you want to tell, you have to tell it your damn self. Like, no one else is going to tell these stories. You know, the whole thing about Toni Morrison, write the book that you want to read.
Yeah.
Yes. You know what I mean? I want to know, you know, about John Mallory Phillips, and he built an entire, you know, he made millions off of oysters in Hampton. How did he do that in the 1800s? I want to know that story, you know, and so no one else is going to write that story for me. And so I have to write it myself. And so I think that might be a little too passionate, but
no, it's
that's,
exactly right.
yeah.
Because I guess my thing is just that I don't think of it as much about like sort of lamenting the fact that like being pessimistic about the mechanism of food media. I'm pessimistic about being beholden to those whims, right? Like the
Yeah.
fickleness of like being beholden to people who are entrenched in the capitalistic system. I can't rely on that kind of better angels narrative that's gonna
Right.
guilt people into being better
That's
by their
right.
own. I mean, so I think something about the necessity of having really specific stories to tell and really being as beholden to the specificity of that is more useful or more valuable takeaway in my mind about this moment, right? Like this thing about sort of your passion or sort of where your real interests are, where you really beholden being evergreen, right? Like no matter how fickle, how many ebbs and flows the industry has, the stories you want to tell are always going to be evergreen because they're always going to have that kind of drive and passion behind them. So I just wonder sometimes about this beholdenness we have to this overarching food media, which isn't actually driving culture, it's reaction to culture as opposed to being the
Yep.
driver of it. And like especially in Black culture, I feel like we are always the trendsetters, tastemakers. We always sort of driving where the zeitgeist is going to go. So why are we taking more agency in that role, right? Like this sort of sense of being more beholden to the story as opposed to what the shiny parts are. I don't know.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, now that that probably is sort of a conversation about racial consciousness and the
That's fair.
duality that Du Bois talked about. You know, like
Yeah. Yeah.
that's probably that conversation.
Well,
You know.
that's a fair point. But I think that something about the folks I know who are centered in that narrative or centered in that way of being, I tend to be less, I don't know, less bewildered
Mm.
by the ebbs and flows because they always happen. I mean, I was rereading Verna May's Vibration Cooking the other day, and something about her
Mm.
talking in the 1970s about the fickleness of food culture, the fickleness of America. She was talking about then. We see ebbs and flows happen constantly. So why are we
Mm.
pretending to be surprised? Like, ain't nothing new under the sun, right? In that way. And so we only have our culture. We only have the stories we are charged with telling.
Right.
So I don't know. I just feel sometimes like we should be maybe less mystified by fickle nature.
Well, no, I think that's true, but I think that also if we have control over, you
Fair.
know,
No.
whether it's a magazine or a podcast or a show, whatever that thing is to drive the narrative forward, you
That's
know,
fair.
someone can't necessarily take that from you. You know what I
Fair.
mean?
Yep.
And then
Yep.
if you are in control, you're beholden to you and whoever your audience is versus what you're talking about, that fickle nature of what's going on in food media. So, you know,
Yeah.
you have to be your own constant, your own rock, and be
Yeah.
true to your own story.
Yeah.
So,
So good. Okay.
all right,
So
that was a
we
word.
we got this has been so good so far. So I want to leave room for questions. We have about 10, 12 minutes left because right after this at 4 o'clock, the very brilliant Jackie Summers is going to be on at 4. So I want to make sure we leave time for folks to take a little breath and then move on to the next 4 o'clock show. But yeah, please, if y'all have any questions for the very brilliant Deb Freeman, please type them in. Let us know. We've been following comments. People have been going up for all your dopeness. So far, but I haven't seen any really specific questions.
I guess look too. I've been trying to focus.
Let's see. So we got about 10 minutes left, 10, 15 minutes left. I
Mm-hmm.
guess I'm really, what are you thinking? Let's see. Because food, politics, we can talk about relations between restaurants. How do you use that research? Oh, okay. So last week I got to talk with Joy Chevalier. She runs an organization called the Cook's Nook. It's kind of like a restaurant incubator. It does a lot of work in helping restaurateurs and chefs to translate or to sort of it provides business resources for folks who buy into her they could become members of her organization, and then they get sort of resource help and a hub to cook through and all that. And she's interested. She was running for like comptroller of uh, city seat in Texas, and she was talking a lot about because she does this event called Taste of Black Austin,
Oh wow.
and it's through the Black Chamber of Commerce there.
Okay.
And she was talking about. Was asking her a question about activating your local chamber and what that looks like for a business owner. Whether, because I mean, again, like I remember my reference point for chambers of commerce are from like growing up in a city. I grew up in North New Jersey. It's a very complicated place. It's the biggest like sort of hub of like politics and who are really outside the city, the state capital, right? Like it's we got all these resources coming in because of the Port Authority and all of this.
Oh
And
yeah.
when I was coming up, it was like the Chamber of Commerce was really sort of this sort of weird hub, especially the Black Chamber was this very strange hub for like, you know, this sort of Jesse Jackson as civil rights, sort of like, you know, Black capitalism at its finest kind of thing, right? And
Mm-hmm.
David Davidson was making the point that sometimes chambers don't necessarily serve the communities in which they're supposed to serve. They serve business interests. And so I guess I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that question. I think would maybe serve if you had any thoughts on the power of the resources of the chamber.
Yeah, I mean the chamber, depending on the location, can have a lot of power. But I think that there are so many restaurants that aren't necessarily a member of the Chamber of Commerce. So you can't have access to the resources that they have unless you join. And so,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and in some instances it's prohibitive because it's expensive, you know, to pay those member fees. And so it's a double-edged sword, right? So it's like, all right, well, you know, we have all these great networking events. There are all these, you know, things that are available to you via tourism or the, you know, our website or, you know, linking you with, you know, people in hospitality. But if the fee to join is out of this world,
Yeah,
why would you even consider it?
yeah,
But it's a useful tool for sure if you can afford to enter it
yeah.
in a lot of locations. So,
I
but
think that's,
I think it's
you don't
useful
think
to.
that's fair? That's a fair point for like any aspect of like business expenses, right? Like you're thinking
Sure.
about like marketing, PR people, all those elements, right? Like you can, if you have the dollars to invest in them, and the payoff is going to be, you got to kind of like do your own like
Yep.
risk reward chart or whatever to sort of decide whether it's something you know be useful for your business. I really like that question. I've been interested a lot in this notion of how to really get more engaged. Like I feel like I live in the middle of Harlem, so like there's
Okay.
this a lot about the community centric activation that's happening, especially in the Latino community, because so many businesses operate in such a small physical space. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you know, 2 block, 3 street radius, they're like 100 restaurants, like something
Wow.
crazy. So their connection to like who our representatives are is really interesting to sort of observe. But yeah, man, that's a really perfect point. I think I talked to Joy about that a little bit. She kind of had the same point, but she didn't really hone in on the point you made about the cost, right? Like you sort
Mm-hmm.
of, it's not just this free resource, right? Like you have to sort of
Right.
be willing to invest in it. So good. So somebody else asked what you are working on, like what you're writing on, thinking on,
Yeah.
working on next.
Yeah. So what I'm working on now is I'm kind of grouping together culinary figures, whether it's I'm doing barbecue, seafood, um, distillers and distilleries, and I'm taking those 3 groups and really kind of honing in on major culinary figures in each of those categories. I think the most interesting one is seafood because you don't necessarily think about that, but there are
Yeah.
so many. Thomas Downing, John Mallory Phillips, you know, just to name 2. The community of Hobson, which is in Virginia, was a self-sufficient oystering community. They built an entire community away from the city, away from everything else, built their own schools, built their own electricity facilities, all through oysters. And so I think that's a really remarkable story. So,
Yeah.
so that's why I'm kind of working on and working through with the research. I see Chef Leanne. She wants to know where her watermelons are. We're we're growing watermelons, heirloom watermelons, and so they are probably about a week and a half, 2 weeks away. So so they will be ready soon.
Yeah, I'm like, what happened? Why am I not aware of these? Um,
You don't know about
um,
watermelons?
I think I may have seen a post you did, but I'm
Yeah.
just saying, like, if there's some sort of, like, watermelon corridor that I'm not apprised of, I need to be in this. Um, yeah, man. Because to your point about seafood though, I don't know if you Skip Finley. He has a new book coming out. It's
Oh.
sort of about, it's like about black whalers, black sort
Yeah,
of.
yeah, yeah. I saw that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm waiting for it to come. It's supposed to be really good. He's an interesting character. It's just very particular. He's living on Martha's Vineyard, so it's this really particular,
Yeah.
like, something about Black Martha's Vineyard is always fascinating to me.
Man, listen.
Um, right.
Talk about some
So
stories.
yeah. But his book is, from what I'm hearing and what I'm sort of like talking to him a little bit, like, it's profoundly researched and it's supposed to be really sort of honed in on its legacy. So you get to keep an eye out for that one.
Yes. Yeah, I
Yeah, man,
saw a
I'm excited
blurb
about what
about
you
that.
have.
But hmm?
Yeah. No.
Oh no, I saw a blurb about it and I thought that was fascinating. It's in my queue actually right now. And
Yeah.
so I know it's coming out soon. I'm not exactly sure when, but I know it's
Yeah.
coming soon.
Yep. Let's see. We got about 6-7 minutes left. I don't know. I don't want to hold you, and I don't want to sort of blame it. But it's so good to talk to you. I've known you brilliant all this time, but to really get a chance to pick your brain has been interesting. I'm always like in love with dexterous minds, and you sort of you have so many disciplines that inform your work. It's so interesting to hear you talk through some of these really interesting concepts.
No, well, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it. This has been a
Yeah.
lot of fun.
Um, oh, also, so yeah, just I don't know, I feel like people should know more about Southern Grit. Like you talked a little bit
Yes.
about how specific it is to Hampton Roads, and just like if you would talk a little bit about that, because
Yeah.
I think I feel like I know Virginia, it's like geography a little bit, and I always think about you relative to Richmond. I don't know why, but I forget that it's no. Move on. Hold on. We're talking about
Yeah, no,
Hampton.
come on a little bit more south. Yeah. No,
So yeah, yeah.
yeah, absolutely. So Southern Grit Magazine, southerngritmagazine.com if you if you want to check out the website, and we're also on Instagram and on Facebook. But yeah, it started out as a Hampton Roads publication, but it really has branched out to cover more of the south, more of the state and some parts of the South as well. But yeah, like I said earlier, it was really created because people didn't think there was a food scene in the Hampton Roads area. And so Hampton Roads is Norfolk, Virginia Beach, Portsmouth, Chesapeake. Sometimes it's Hampton and Newport News, but it's right along the coast, and it's beautiful. There you can't drive 10 minutes without hitting water, some sort of body of water. But yeah, and so like people kind of, because it's a Navy town, the world's largest naval base is actually in Norfolk
Right.
as well. So there's just this really interesting influx of cultures coming in and that sort of thing. And so um, that was the original tenet of it, and being honest about what
Yeah.
was good, what wasn't good, what were the food issues facing the area. And so, in the past couple of years, that's branched out towards the rest of the state because, Virginia got something to say, and so really talking about more broadly about all the things that come from Virginia, and really trying to elevate the idea that that Southern food, as we know it, most of it pretty much started here. And so it's really been a great experience to work with Southern Grit and work with the magazine. We've put on dinners called Stirring the Pot, and our first one was about James Hemings. We've also honored Black watermen. And so like those are the kinds of things that Southern Grit is known for, just being really not only honest, but really respectful of stories and really respecting history and telling that history for everyone. So yeah, it's a really great publication.
I love it. Yeah, so thank you so much, Deb. I'm
Thank
so
you.
thankful to have had this time with you. Please check out Southern Grit magazine. Check out Deb's personal Instagram. You will, and socials in general. Her tweets are prolific. So you want to be following her and checking her what she's got going on. But thank you so much. I'm hoping folks will deep dive into the work you're doing and so be more curious about food history. I feel like this, like like I know once you notice these stories, you can't they infect and infuse into the work you do. So
Absolutely.
appreciate
Thank
you.
you so much.
Alrighty.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right, y'all. That was so dope. Her mind is so brilliant. I love it. So take a little breather. And Jackie Summers is up next at 4 o'clock. So take a breath, come back at 4, get your life. Yeah, thank y'all.